Most queer films tell you that coming out is a war. Young Hearts argues that it can actually be an act of subtraction, taking away the things you were never meant to carry. That idea is quietly embedded in the film from its opening moments, before Elias even has the language to understand what is happening inside him. We begin with music, community, family, and the familiar rituals of a small-town life, but underneath all that warmth is a strange absence. Everyone seems to know what life is supposed to look like except Elias. He is surrounded by people who love him, yet he cannot quite locate himself inside the future they seem to imagine for him. That contradiction is what makes Young Hearts so interesting. This is not a story where a cruel parent or vicious bully creates the central problem. There is no single villain standing between Elias and happiness. Instead, the pressure comes from something much quieter, the assumption that everyone already knows the script. The opening concert becomes a miniature version of that world. Music fills the space, adults perform their identities with confidence, and Elias watches. He is physically present, but emotionally he is slightly outside the frame, absorbing a culture that seems completely natural to everyone around him. And if you grew up queer, you may recognize that feeling immediately. It is not necessarily the memory of being attacked. Sometimes it is the memory of sitting in a perfectly ordinary room and realizing that everyone else seems to understand something about themselves that you do not. That is the information gap at the heart of Elias's story. His family can be supportive because they are not consciously rejecting him. The problem is that Elias has not yet imagined the possibility that he can be different and still belong. Support cannot always reach a person who does not yet know what they need permission to say. This is where the film's gentleness becomes more radical than it first appears. Young Hearts does not need to invent a monstrous outside force because it understands that heteronormativity often works without one. Nobody has to tell Elias, explicitly, that boys are supposed to like girls. The world simply keeps demonstrating that assumption until it becomes background noise. The concert is therefore not just an opening atmosphere piece. It establishes the invisible architecture Elias will spend the rest of the film trying to understand. And notice how the film makes this discomfort almost pleasant. The colors are warm. The environment feels familiar. The people around him are not presented as monsters. That matters because the hardest cages are not always the ones that look like cages. Sometimes they look like home. The song ends, but the feeling, that hollow sense that something is missing, is just beginning. And that missing thing eventually takes a shape, a face, and a name when Alexander enters Elias's world. What happens next is one of the most recognizable experiences in any coming-of-age story, the crush. But Young Hearts understands that a first queer crush carries a particular kind of electricity because the attraction itself can arrive before the meaning does. Elias does not begin with a neat declaration of identity. He begins with attention. He notices Alexander. He watches him. He becomes interested in where Alexander is, what he is doing, how he moves, how he talks, and eventually how Elias feels whenever Alexander is nearby. That is why the film's treatment of the gaze is so important. The camera repeatedly places us close to Elias's perspective, allowing Alexander to become larger in his emotional field than he necessarily is in the physical world. This is how a crush actually works. Someone can be sitting across a room, doing absolutely nothing extraordinary, and somehow your brain has turned that person into the most important object in existence. The world does not change, but your attention does. Suddenly a glance feels like evidence. A smile becomes an event. A conversation gets replayed later because your mind is searching it for hidden meaning. Young Hearts captures that physical sensation without turning it into melodrama. Elias is not immediately delivering speeches about destiny. He is simply becoming aware of another person with an intensity he does not know how to categorize. And if you are watching this as an adult who remembers being 14, that can be almost painfully nostalgic. You may remember having a crush before you had language for what kind of crush it was. You may remember staring too long, then looking away too quickly. You may remember convincing yourself that your fascination was friendship because friendship was the category you were allowed to have. That is one reason the film can hit so deeply. It does not only represent queer identity. It represents the prehistory of identity, the period before you understand what your feelings mean. Cinematically, this is where the movie becomes more sophisticated than its simple premise might suggest. The camera does not need to announce that Elias is falling in love. It can show us through duration, proximity, reaction, and repetition. We learn to watch Alexander because Elias is learning to watch Alexander. The audience becomes trapped inside the same attention loop. This is crucial because attraction is not just an intellectual realization. It is physical. Your body knows before your vocabulary catches up. Your eyes move towards someone automatically. Your mood changes when they enter a room. You suddenly care about your appearance in ways you cannot explain. A film about first love has to understand those sensations, and Young Hearts often does. It lets awkwardness remain awkward. It lets silence remain silence. It does not constantly decorate the relationship with dramatic music to tell you when something important is happening. Sometimes the important thing is simply that Elias cannot stop looking. And for viewers who spent their own adolescence wondering whether their feelings were real, that attention can feel like recognition. Your nostalgia makes sense because first love is rarely remembered as a sequence of logical decisions. It is remembered as flashes, a face, a hallway, a song, a conversation that seemed ordinary to everyone except you. Young Hearts understands that memory operates the same way. The film is not merely telling us that Elias likes Alexander. It is recreating the strange experience of discovering that another person has suddenly become part of your internal landscape. But there is another reason this crush feels different. Elias is not only wondering whether Alexander likes him. He is also wondering what liking Alexander says about him. That second question transforms an ordinary crush into an identity crisis. If Elias were already comfortable with himself, attraction could simply be attraction. Instead, every feeling carries a second layer of interpretation. Is this friendship? Is this admiration? Is this jealousy? Is this something else? The more he tries to classify the feeling, the more overwhelming it becomes. And that brings us to the environment around him, because Elias's confusion does not develop in a vacuum. It develops in a place that is beautiful, familiar, and quietly restrictive. Young Hearts comes from Belgian filmmaker Anthony Schatteman, and the film carries a semi-autobiographical emotional quality that helps explain its unusually patient attention to adolescent uncertainty. Rather than treating queer adolescence as an exotic crisis, Schatteman approaches it as something intimate and recognizable. The rural Belgian setting is particularly effective because it creates a soft trap. There is no constant threat hanging over every scene. Instead, the town feels enclosed by familiarity. Everybody knows everybody. Traditions repeat. Families have histories. Expectations travel from one generation to another without needing to be announced. That environment is not evil. In many ways, it is comforting. And that is exactly why it can be difficult to resist. When a place gives you belonging, questioning its expectations can feel like risking the belonging itself. This is one of the film's smartest choices. If the setting were openly hostile, Elias's conflict would be easy to understand. He would simply be trying to escape prejudice. But because the environment is mostly loving, the problem becomes psychological. How do you reject an expectation when the people holding that expectation genuinely care about you? How do you tell your family that the future they imagine for you is not your future when they never intended to hurt you in the first place? The answer cannot simply be rebellion. Elias has to discover himself while remaining connected to the people around him. That makes his journey slower and, in some ways, more realistic. The countryside also works symbolically. It feels open, with fields and roads and enormous stretches of sky, yet Elias's emotional world can feel incredibly small. The contrast matters. Physical freedom does not automatically create psychological freedom. You can stand in an enormous field and still feel trapped by one sentence you cannot bring yourself to say. That tension gives the film much of its emotional texture. Looking back at queer coming-of-age cinema, it is easy to understand why this approach feels refreshing. So many stories have historically used violence, rejection, or death to establish the seriousness of queer experience. Those stories can be important, and they reflect real histories of discrimination. But they are not the only stories available. Young Hearts asks what happens when the drama comes from the internal process of becoming honest rather than surviving an external catastrophe. That choice does not make the film conflict-free. It simply relocates the conflict. The setting is established, but the real map we need to navigate isn't of the town, but of Elias's own social performance. Elias's relationship with Valerie is where that performance becomes especially revealing. It would be easy to describe Valerie as the unfortunate girl caught inside a lie, but that interpretation is too simple. Elias is not necessarily manipulating her. He is trying to understand himself through a social script that everyone else seems to understand automatically. Valerie represents what is expected to happen. Boy meets girl. Boy likes girl. Boy dates girl. Everyone approves. There is a certain comfort in that sequence because it requires no explanation. Elias can follow it and temporarily avoid the question that frightens him. The tragedy is not that he does not care about Valerie. The tragedy is that he does not fully understand why the relationship does not make him feel the way he thinks it should. That distinction matters. Closeted teenagers are often described as liars, but many are actually performers trapped inside a role they were handed before they knew there were alternatives. Elias's behavior with Valerie can therefore be read less as deception and more as an attempt to become legible. He is testing whether the conventional version of himself might eventually feel natural if he performs it long enough. You can probably recognize the emotional logic even if your own experience looked different. Maybe you dated someone because everyone expected you to. Maybe you developed an exaggerated interest in celebrities of the socially approved gender. Maybe you laughed at jokes, participated in conversations, or pretended to have crushes because admitting uncertainty felt more dangerous than pretending certainty. None of that necessarily means you were consciously constructing an elaborate lie. Sometimes you are simply following the road that has been placed in front of you because you do not know another road exists. Young Hearts gives Elias room to occupy that uncomfortable middle ground. Valerie is not a villain, and Elias is not a villain. The relationship is simply built around an identity Elias has not yet examined honestly. That is why his interactions with her can feel simultaneously sincere and painful. He wants the relationship to work because he wants the expected story to work. If it works, then perhaps he does not have to ask the harder question. But Alexander changes the equation. Alexander does not arrive merely as a romantic interest. He arrives as a catalyst. More importantly, he becomes a mirror. Before Alexander, Elias can define himself through the expectations around him. After Alexander, Elias has to look inward. This is a classic coming-of-age structure, but the film uses it with enough emotional patience to make it feel personal rather than mechanical. Alexander is more open, more comfortable with himself, and more willing to move through the world without constantly checking whether his feelings fit the approved script. That contrast creates immediate friction. Elias sees in Alexander not only someone he likes, but a version of emotional freedom he does not yet possess. The city boy and the country boy archetype could easily have become simplistic. One represents sophistication, the other innocence. One brings freedom, the other brings repression. But Young Hearts softens those distinctions. Alexander is not perfect simply because he is more confident. Elias is not backwards because he is afraid. They are two teenagers standing at different points in the same process of becoming themselves. That is what makes their connection compelling. Alexander does not magically fix Elias. Instead, his presence makes it impossible for Elias to keep pretending that nothing is happening. He creates a before and after. Once you have felt a connection that seems real, the old script becomes harder to perform convincingly. This is where the film's use of archetype becomes useful rather than predictable. The catalyst does not have to be a person who teaches the protagonist a lesson. Sometimes the catalyst is simply the person who makes self-deception impossible. Alexander's greatest function in Elias's story is therefore not romantic fulfillment. It is reflection. Elias looks at Alexander and, gradually, begins to see himself. Alexander brings the energy, but Elias brings the resistance. Let's look at why it's so hard for him to let that energy in. Because the biggest obstacle in Young Hearts is not that Elias cannot fall in love. It is that he has been trained to distrust what happens when he does. This is where the film's invisible antagonist becomes clearer. Heteronormativity does not need to shout. It can operate through ordinary rituals, casual assumptions, and seemingly harmless instructions. Consider something as mundane as learning how to shave. A lesson like that can be affectionate, practical, even intimate. But within the broader structure of the film, it also becomes part of a cultural education in masculinity. Elias is being taught what a young man is supposed to look like, how he is supposed to behave, and eventually, by implication, who he is supposed to desire. None of these lessons individually constitute persecution. That is the point. The pressure becomes powerful because it is cumulative. One expectation is easy to dismiss. Hundreds of expectations become an identity. The same thing happens at school, where courtship rituals are treated almost like universal laws. Who likes whom? Who is dating whom? What counts as attractive? What kind of relationship is considered normal enough to discuss openly? Notice how the teacher can speak about courtship without ever becoming a traditional bully. The film doesn't show a bully, it shows a system that teaches you exactly what to want, long before you know who you are. That distinction is central to the movie's thesis. External hatred is visible, and because it is visible, it can be confronted. Internalized expectations are much harder. They become part of your own voice. Elias does not always need someone else to tell him that something is wrong. He can tell himself. He can anticipate judgment before anyone has judged him. He can imagine rejection before rejection has happened. That is the mechanism of internalized shame. It creates invisible walls around possibilities that have never actually been tested. And because those walls are invisible, the person inside them can believe they are simply being realistic. This is why the film's safety versus growth dynamic is so effective. Staying closeted may feel safe. If you do not say anything, nobody can reject what they do not know. But the safety comes at a price. Elias is protected from one kind of pain while being trapped inside another. Coming out, meanwhile, feels dangerous precisely because it introduces uncertainty. He cannot control how other people will react. Yet it also creates the possibility of a life that is internally coherent. Young Hearts never pretends that honesty is effortless. Instead, it suggests that authenticity can be frightening and still be worth pursuing. That is a much more mature message than simply saying, "Be yourself," as though selfhood were a button you could press. Elias has to unlearn an entire social grammar. He has to discover that the absence of certainty does not mean the presence of danger. He has to learn that not every unfamiliar feeling needs to be suppressed. And most importantly, he has to understand that shame is not evidence. Feeling wrong does not mean being wrong. That idea echoes through the film's soundscape as well. Music becomes one of the ways Young Hearts distinguishes inherited identity from emerging identity. The father's musical world carries tradition, performance, confidence, and a kind of public masculinity. His Schlagerpop atmosphere belongs to a world where identity can be projected outward. You sing, people listen, and everyone understands the role you are playing. Elias's emotional world is almost the opposite. When he is alone with Alexander, the film can become quieter. Sometimes the absence of music is more revealing than a swelling romantic score. Silence creates a private space where the boys are not performing for anyone. The sound design therefore participates in the film's central contrast between public identity and private feeling. The father's music is not presented as inherently bad. It is part of family culture, memory, and tradition. But it also represents the world Elias has inherited. Alexander represents something different, not necessarily rebellion, but possibility. When the soundtrack recedes around them, we become aware of how much noise surrounds Elias everywhere else. Family expectations, school rituals, social assumptions, conversations about relationships, and the constant pressure to know who you are all disappear for a moment. What remains is simply two people sharing space. That is why the quieter scenes can feel so intimate. The film is not telling us that love needs orchestral music to be important. Sometimes love becomes more convincing when the movie stops announcing it. The contrast also reflects the father's own performative relationship with masculinity. His musical persona is external. Elias's journey is internal. One performs identity loudly, the other is trying to discover whether he can inhabit identity honestly at all. This does not make the father a symbol of everything wrong with masculinity. Again, the film is more nuanced than that. The older generation carries traditions that can be restrictive and loving at the same time. The younger generation has to decide what to keep and what to release. That process becomes painfully visible when Elias reaches what might be called his worst day. He retreats to the barn, away from everyone, carrying a shame that has become heavier than the original conflict. This scene is crucial because the bullies, social pressure, and external circumstances are not actually the deepest threat. Shame is. Why do we sabotage the people we love most when we're scared? It's not spite, it's a self-preservation reflex. We push away the person who can see us because being seen suddenly feels more dangerous than being alone. Elias's retreat is therefore not simply an escape from other people. It is an attempt to regain control over a self that feels exposed. The barn becomes a physical representation of internalized shame. It is private, enclosed, removed from the social world. But privacy can become isolation when you are using it to hide from yourself. That is what makes the scene hurt. Elias is not necessarily running from Alexander because he has stopped caring. He is running because he cares too much and does not yet know how to survive the implications. For anyone who has experienced closeted adolescence, this can be an especially difficult scene to watch. Shame can convince you that the safest thing is to destroy the evidence that you ever wanted anything. If you cannot control your feelings, perhaps you can control the relationship. If you cannot make yourself stop caring, perhaps you can make the other person leave. It is irrational from the outside and completely understandable from the inside. Young Hearts does not excuse the hurt Elias causes, but it contextualizes it. That distinction is important. A compassionate film does not have to pretend that fear makes every action harmless. It can instead ask us to understand the emotional mechanism behind the action. Elias's self-sabotage is painful precisely because it is recognizable. He is trying to protect himself from a future he has not yet learned to imagine. And this is where the film's refusal to rely heavily on external villains becomes most powerful. If the bullies were the central problem, defeating them would solve the story. But because shame is the problem, the solution has to happen inside Elias. Nobody else can perform that work for him. Alexander can offer love. His family can offer support. His grandfather can offer perspective. But Elias eventually has to decide that he deserves to live without hiding. The music fades, leaving us with the most uncomfortable sound of all, the sound of a boy keeping a secret he no longer wants to hold. That secret connects Elias not only to his peers but to the generations before him, which is why the grandfather becomes such an important presence. In queer stories, older generations are often positioned as obstacles or relics, people who cannot understand the younger character's identity. Young Hearts offers something gentler. The grandfather becomes a bridge. His presence quietly challenges the assumption that queerness is a modern problem created by contemporary culture. The feelings Elias is experiencing are new to him, but they are not new to humanity. Love, longing, fear, secrecy, and the desire to be known have existed across generations. The grandfather's role is powerful because he embodies memory. He has lived through a different social world, and that gives him a perspective Elias cannot yet possess. When you are 14, every emotion feels like it has just been invented. Every fear feels permanent. Every mistake feels like it will define the rest of your life. Older people can sometimes offer the most valuable counterargument simply by having survived their own uncertainty. The grandfather does not need to give Elias a perfect speech about identity. His existence already expands the timeline. It tells us that life continues beyond adolescence. That matters enormously in a coming-of-age story because teenage anxiety often operates as though the present is the entire universe. The person you are today feels like the person you will always be. The grandfather quietly disproves that. He represents continuity rather than catastrophe. Instead of saying, "This is the moment that determines everything," the film suggests, "This is one moment in a much longer life." That is another way Young Hearts resists the tragic tradition of queer cinema. It refuses to make adolescence the final judgment on queer existence. Elias can be confused now and still become confident later. He can make mistakes and still repair them. He can lose control and still find his way back. The grandfather therefore provides something more profound than acceptance. He provides historical perspective. He reminds us that queer people have always existed, even when the language, visibility, and social conditions surrounding them were different. That perspective also deepens the film's treatment of family. The family is not simply an institution Elias must escape. It is a place containing multiple generations, each carrying different ideas about what a good life looks like. The challenge is not necessarily to reject the family but to create room within it for a more honest version of himself. This is where the film's radical gentleness becomes especially apparent. It imagines coming out not as a dramatic severing but as an expansion of the truth. The family does not have to become the enemy for Elias to become himself. That is a hopeful idea, but it is not naive. It acknowledges that even loving people can participate in restrictive systems without realizing it. The question is whether they can adjust when the person they love asks them to see more clearly. By the third act, the emotional pressure has become too great for Elias to maintain the performance. And then comes the necessary break, the argument, the moment where everything he has been holding inside finally erupts. On paper, this is a familiar coming-of-age beat. The protagonist loses control, says the wrong thing, pushes away the person they love, and creates a crisis that must eventually be resolved. It is a trope. But that does not automatically make it bad. In fact, this may be the most honest part of Elias's arc because self-discovery is rarely graceful. We sometimes imagine authenticity as a beautiful moment where a character calmly announces exactly who they are and everyone responds with understanding. Real people are messy. Fear makes us defensive. Shame makes us angry. Confusion can come out as cruelty because anger is easier to express than vulnerability. Elias's shouting match works because it allows the film to acknowledge that becoming honest does not instantly make you emotionally mature. He is still a teenager. He is still learning. He is allowed to be overwhelmed. But the scene also forces a distinction between explanation and excuse. Elias's fear explains his behavior, but it does not erase its consequences. That is important because a film about queer self-acceptance should not have to make its protagonist morally flawless to deserve empathy. In fact, allowing Elias to behave badly for a moment makes his eventual growth more believable. He has to see the damage created by hiding. He has to understand that protecting himself at all costs can hurt the people who are trying to love him. And he has to learn that vulnerability cannot be built entirely around what feels safe. This is the dialectic at the center of the movie, safety versus growth. The closet offers a kind of immediate safety because it minimizes exposure. But it also keeps Elias from experiencing the full reality of his relationships. Honesty introduces risk, but it also creates the possibility of genuine connection. The shouting match is therefore not simply the low point before the happy ending. It is a pattern interrupt. Elias's old strategy has stopped working. He cannot return to pretending that nothing is happening because the truth has already changed him. Once you know that you are capable of loving someone, ignorance is no longer available as a permanent solution. That is why the argument feels less like a conventional breakup than a necessary collapse of the old identity. The performance has finally become unsustainable. After the dust of that argument settles, we aren't left with a breakup. We're left with the first real opportunity for truth. And what makes the ending of Young Hearts so affecting is that it does not need to turn that truth into a gigantic romantic spectacle. There is no requirement for fireworks, grand declarations, or a perfect future wrapped in a bow. The film's idea of happiness is quieter. It is sustainable. That may be the most important choice it makes. A traditional romantic ending asks whether the couple gets together. Young Hearts asks a slightly different question: can these characters exist honestly now? That distinction matters because romance is only one part of queer self-acceptance. Elias's relationship with Alexander matters deeply, but the larger victory is that Elias no longer has to organize his life around hiding from himself. The happy ending is therefore not simply about getting the boy. It is about becoming someone who can receive love without immediately assuming that love is evidence of danger. For a teenager, that is enormous. The ending also resists the pressure to predict everything. We do not need to know exactly what Elias's adulthood will look like. We do not need a guarantee that every future relationship will work. We do not even need certainty that first love will become forever love. That would actually weaken the story. First love does not have to last forever to be real. Sometimes the purpose of first love is to introduce you to a part of yourself that you did not know existed. Alexander can be important to Elias without becoming the sole explanation for his identity. That is what makes the ending feel emotionally sustainable rather than artificially perfect. The film allows hope to remain hope. It does not convert it into certainty. And for queer audiences who grew up with stories where coming out meant losing everything, that difference can feel almost revolutionary. We have spent decades watching queer characters suffer because cinema often treated pain as proof of seriousness. If a queer story ended happily, there was sometimes a fear that it would seem unrealistic, sentimental, or politically weak. Young Hearts challenges that assumption simply by allowing tenderness to remain the dominant emotional register. It says that a queer story does not become more important because someone dies. It does not become more mature because someone is rejected. It does not need catastrophe to earn our attention. Sometimes the radical act is letting a young queer person be frightened, confused, loved, and still okay. That brings us to the larger question of why a movie like this matters now. The answer is not that tragedy has disappeared. It has not. Queer young people still experience isolation, discrimination, family conflict, and fear. A gentle film cannot erase those realities. But representation is not only about documenting the worst things that can happen to us. It is also about expanding the imagination of what can happen. If every queer coming-of-age story teaches you to expect pain, eventually pain starts to feel like part of the identity itself. Young Hearts offers another possibility. It says you can grow up queer and still have ordinary memories. You can have a crush. You can be awkward. You can make mistakes. You can embarrass yourself. You can argue with your parents. You can fall in love. You can have a family that is complicated without being monstrous. You can be scared without being doomed. You can have a happy ending that does not require you to become a symbol. And that is why the film's radical act is not simply being happy. It is being okay. There is something deeply political about a queer story that refuses to make suffering its only evidence of truth. Happiness becomes a form of resistance when the culture around you has repeatedly suggested that queer life must be exceptional, dangerous, tragic, or difficult to justify. A happy queer movie says something surprisingly confrontational. Our lives are allowed to contain softness. Our memories are allowed to be ordinary. Our first loves are allowed to be awkward and sweet rather than permanently traumatic. If you grew up waiting for a movie like this to tell you that your first love didn't have to be a tragedy, this is the video for you. Because maybe the deepest power of Young Hearts is not that it gives every queer teenager a perfect world. It does not. Its power is that it gives them a believable one. A world where the biggest battle can happen inside your own head, where the people around you can learn alongside you, where mistakes do not automatically become endings, and where coming out is not the moment your life begins but the moment you stop carrying a life that was never yours. For those of us watching as adults, that can create a strange emotional response. You are not only watching Elias. You are watching the version of yourself who once needed someone to say that there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the way you felt. Maybe you needed Alexander. Maybe you needed the grandfather. Maybe you needed a family that could listen. Maybe you simply needed one story where the queer kid reached the end and was still there, still loved, still capable of imagining tomorrow. That does not erase whatever came before. It does not rewrite adolescence. But it can change the way we remember it. And perhaps that is the quiet gift Young Hearts offers. It cannot go back and make us 14 again. It cannot remove every lonely afternoon, every confused crush, every secret we were afraid to speak. But it can give those memories a different ending in our imagination. It can remind us that the problem was never that we wanted too much. We wanted something incredibly simple, to be known and still be loved. Young Hearts understands that desire, and instead of turning it into a tragedy, it lets it breathe. That is why its gentleness matters. That is why its imperfections matter too. The film does not reinvent every coming-of-age convention, and it does not need to. Its achievement is more specific. It takes familiar machinery, the crush, the secrecy, the social expectations, the misunderstanding, the argument, the reconciliation, and asks what happens when the story refuses to punish its queer protagonist simply for being queer. The answer is not a revolution in plot. It is a revolution in emotional permission. You are allowed to want. You are allowed to be confused. You are allowed to grow slowly. You are allowed to make mistakes and repair them. You are allowed to imagine a future that is not defined by surviving your identity. And maybe most importantly, you are allowed to be okay. That is a small sentence, but for generations of queer viewers, it can carry an enormous weight. Young Hearts does not tell us that queer adolescence is easy. It tells us that difficulty is not the only story worth telling. Sometimes the most radical ending is simply a young person looking toward the future and realizing they do not have to disappear to belong in it. And maybe that is where Young Hearts becomes most valuable to the adults watching it now. Because when you revisit your own adolescence through a story like this, nostalgia does something strange. It can make the past feel softer than it actually was, while also reminding you of how intensely everything used to matter. At 14, a glance could ruin your entire afternoon. A text message could determine your mood for the rest of the day. Someone sitting beside you in class could make you suddenly conscious of your hands, your voice, your clothes, your entire existence. And when you were queer, there could be another layer underneath all of that. You were not simply wondering whether someone liked you. You were sometimes wondering whether you were even allowed to like them. That distinction is easy to underestimate as an adult. We have language now that many young people in previous generations did not have. We can describe bisexuality, homosexuality, gender expression, coming out, internalized shame, heteronormativity, and all the complicated spaces between those words. But language does not automatically make discovery easy. In some ways, knowing more can make the early uncertainty even more complicated, because once you have heard the categories, you can become frightened of choosing the wrong one. Elias's story works because he does not begin with a label. He begins with a feeling. That is one of the most humane things about the movie. It does not demand that Elias immediately become an expert on himself. He is allowed to be confused. He is allowed to notice Alexander before he understands why he keeps noticing him. He is allowed to experience jealousy without having a perfectly articulated theory of attraction. He is allowed to be a teenager before he becomes a representative of anything. And that matters because queer characters in cinema have often been asked to carry enormous symbolic weight. They are expected to represent an entire community, an entire political history, sometimes an entire argument about acceptance. Young Hearts occasionally brushes against that responsibility, but it mostly chooses something smaller and more intimate. It lets Elias be one kid. One kid who has a crush. One kid who is scared. One kid who does not know what to do with the fact that his feelings are becoming impossible to ignore. That simplicity is deceptive. Because once you remove the conventional machinery of tragedy, you have to find another way to create dramatic tension. Young Hearts finds it inside the gap between what Elias feels and what he believes he is supposed to feel. That gap is where the entire movie lives. Think about how many coming-of-age stories are built around a character discovering what they want. Young Hearts adds a second question: what happens when wanting something immediately makes you question who you are? Elias's desire for Alexander is not frightening because Alexander is dangerous. It is frightening because the feeling exposes a contradiction between Elias's inner world and the future he has been unconsciously rehearsing. That is why Valerie matters so much. She is not simply the obstacle between Elias and Alexander. She is the evidence that Elias has been trying to follow a path that made sense before he understood himself. Their relationship becomes a kind of experiment. Elias is testing the hypothesis that if he behaves like the person everyone expects him to be, eventually he will feel like that person. But feelings do not work like that. You cannot always manufacture desire through good intentions. You cannot force yourself into an identity simply because it would make everyone comfortable. And you cannot always reason your way out of a feeling that has already taken root. For a closeted teenager, that realization can be terrifying because the conventional script offers a strange kind of security. If you follow it, you know where the milestones are supposed to be. Dating, marriage, family, adulthood. The path has already been mapped. The alternative can feel like stepping into fog. This is why the movie's rural setting becomes more than scenery. The countryside represents a world in which continuity matters. Traditions repeat. Families know one another. People grow up surrounded by the same cultural assumptions that shaped the people before them. There is beauty in that continuity, but there can also be pressure. The interesting thing is that the film does not treat tradition as automatically oppressive. The father's music, family gatherings, familiar routines, and community life all have genuine warmth. There is affection here. There is history. There are things worth preserving. The question is not whether Elias should reject all of it. The question is whether there is room inside that world for him to become himself. That is a much more complicated question than simply asking whether his family is accepting. Because acceptance is not only what happens after someone comes out. It is also what a person has learned to imagine before coming out. If Elias cannot imagine himself being accepted as queer, then even a supportive family can feel emotionally inaccessible. He is fighting a future that may not actually exist, but his fear does not know that yet. And this is where the movie's emotional intelligence becomes clear. Young Hearts understands that internalized shame often survives in the absence of active hatred. You can grow up around decent people and still absorb damaging ideas. You can have parents who love you and still assume that certain parts of yourself would disappoint them. You can attend a school where nobody is openly attacking you and still understand exactly which version of yourself receives the most approval. That is what makes heteronormativity so difficult to dramatize. There is rarely one moment you can point to and say, there. That is the thing that caused it. Instead, there are hundreds of tiny moments. The jokes. The assumptions. The questions. The conversations about girlfriends. The expectations around masculinity. The casual language adults use when discussing the future. The way boys are taught to behave around girls. The way romance is presented as something that naturally happens between a boy and a girl. None of these moments necessarily feels devastating. But they accumulate. And when you are young, accumulation becomes reality. You start learning what is normal before you have consciously decided what normal means. That is why the school scenes are so important. The classroom is not merely a place where Elias receives information. It is a place where he receives social information. He is learning not only mathematics or history, but the unofficial curriculum of adolescence. Who should date whom? What kind of attraction is expected? What kind of masculinity earns approval? What kind of vulnerability is acceptable? And what kinds of feelings are not even discussed? The film understands that sometimes the most powerful messages are the ones nobody thinks to explain. If everyone around you behaves as though heterosexuality is simply the default, you may never hear the sentence, "Queer people are not normal." You do not need to. The absence of alternatives can communicate the same idea. That is why the film's gentleness should not be mistaken for a lack of conflict. The conflict is everywhere. It is simply embedded in the environment rather than concentrated in one villain. This is one of the places where the movie's approach differs from more trauma-driven queer cinema. A story centered on overt homophobia can give the audience a clear enemy. You know what the protagonist is fighting. You know what injustice looks like. Young Hearts asks you to pay attention to something harder. What if the enemy is an assumption? What if the thing keeping you from happiness is not a person who hates you, but a story you have unconsciously accepted about what your life is supposed to look like? That is harder to defeat because you cannot simply walk away from it. You have to examine yourself. And examining yourself can be terrifying. Elias's relationship with Alexander becomes powerful because Alexander does not merely introduce romance into the story. He introduces contradiction. Before Alexander, Elias can continue moving along the expected path. After Alexander, every step becomes questionable. The more Elias notices Alexander, the harder it becomes to convince himself that his feelings are meaningless. And the more he tries to suppress them, the more important they become. This is the paradox of repression. What you refuse to acknowledge can become the thing you think about most. That is why the movie's visual language around looking matters so much. Attraction begins with attention. Elias's eyes repeatedly return to Alexander because his emotional world keeps returning there too. Cinema is uniquely equipped to show this. A novel can tell us that a character is obsessed. A film can simply let us watch him watching someone. The audience experiences the crush through repetition. Alexander appears, Elias reacts, and suddenly we understand that the important event is not necessarily what Alexander is doing. It is what Elias is doing with his attention. That is the difference between observing a character and experiencing a character's emotional perspective. And for anyone who remembers a first crush, that perspective can be almost embarrassingly familiar. You know the feeling. You are trying not to look. You look anyway. You wonder whether they noticed. Then you wonder whether noticing would have meant anything. Then you spend 20 minutes analyzing a 3-second interaction. This is the ridiculousness of first love. It is also one of the most universal experiences in human life. Young Hearts gets that. It does not make queer desire fundamentally alien. It makes it recognizable. The difference is that Elias has another question attached to it. What does this mean about me? That question turns romance into identity. And once identity enters the equation, every little moment becomes heavier. A normal crush can be embarrassing. A queer crush, especially before you have accepted yourself, can feel like evidence. Evidence that you are different. Evidence that you have been hiding something. Evidence that the future you imagined might not belong to you. This is why the movie's emotional stakes can feel much larger than the plot itself. On paper, very little happens. A boy meets another boy. They become close. Feelings develop. Confusion follows. People get hurt. Truth eventually becomes possible. But emotionally, that is enormous. Because the story is not really about whether Elias can date Alexander. It is about whether Elias can survive knowing himself. That is the deeper coming-of-age story. And this is where Anthony Schatteman's semi-autobiographical approach becomes important. When a filmmaker draws from personal emotional experience, the goal is not necessarily to recreate every literal event. It is to preserve the emotional truth of a particular age. Young Hearts feels interested in that emotional truth. The awkwardness. The uncertainty. The strange intensity of adolescence. The feeling that everyone else has received a manual for growing up except you. That last feeling is especially important for queer audiences because adolescence can create the illusion that everyone else is moving naturally toward adulthood while you are standing still. You watch classmates develop crushes. You hear friends talk about relationships. You see adults assuming what your future will look like. And perhaps you participate. You laugh. You nod. You play along. Meanwhile, somewhere underneath all of it, you are asking yourself a question you do not know how to phrase. Why does this not feel like me? That is Elias. And that is why his masking behavior should not be interpreted simply as dishonesty. Masking is often an attempt to achieve safety. If you do not understand yourself, you copy what seems to work for everyone else. You imitate. You perform. You wait for authenticity to arrive afterward. Maybe if you act normal long enough, you will eventually feel normal. Maybe if you date the right person, the confusion will disappear. Maybe if you stop looking at Alexander, the feeling will go away. Maybe if you become the version of yourself everyone expects, you will stop being afraid. But the movie slowly demonstrates the flaw in that logic. You cannot become comfortable inside yourself by permanently avoiding yourself. Eventually, the performance becomes exhausting. And exhaustion is one of the most underappreciated elements of closeted adolescence. People often talk about fear. They talk about rejection. They talk about bullying. But there is also fatigue. The fatigue of monitoring yourself. The fatigue of deciding what to say. The fatigue of checking whether a sentence sounded suspicious. The fatigue of editing your reactions before anyone else can see them. The fatigue of pretending that something important does not matter. Young Hearts captures that exhaustion without turning Elias into a permanently miserable character. That is important. He still laughs. He still enjoys things. He still has friends. He still experiences ordinary teenage happiness. Being closeted does not mean every second of your life is tragic. Sometimes you are having the best day of your life while carrying a secret. That contradiction is part of what makes the experience so difficult to explain afterward. People might look back and say, "But you were happy." And you were. That does not mean you were free. Young Hearts understands the difference. Freedom is not the absence of happiness. It is the ability to experience happiness without constantly editing yourself. That is what Elias is moving toward. And Alexander becomes the person who makes that possibility visible. Not because Alexander is some magical enlightened figure who has all the answers. But because he seems to exist with a different relationship to himself. His presence gives Elias something to compare against. This is the mirror function of the love interest. Alexander is not simply someone Elias wants. He is someone through whom Elias discovers what wanting can feel like when it is not immediately converted into shame. That is why the city boy and country boy contrast works best when it remains emotional rather than geographical. Alexander carries an energy of possibility. Elias carries an energy of hesitation. One moves toward experience. The other keeps checking whether experience is permitted. Put them together and the story naturally creates friction. Not because they are opposites in every way, but because each boy exposes something in the other. Elias reminds Alexander that vulnerability can be complicated. Alexander reminds Elias that vulnerability does not automatically lead to disaster. That is a powerful exchange because neither character has to be perfect for the relationship to matter. And this is where the film quietly challenges another convention of queer romance. It does not make the relationship valuable only because it survives oppression. The romance has value because these two people genuinely enjoy one another. That sounds obvious. But representation has not always allowed queer characters that luxury. Sometimes queer romance exists primarily to demonstrate injustice. Sometimes the relationship is important because the characters suffer for it. Young Hearts gives the relationship space to simply be a relationship. There is awkwardness. There is excitement. There is curiosity. There is misunderstanding. There is tenderness. There is the strange comedy of two young people discovering what they are supposed to do with feelings that are bigger than their experience. That is what makes the romance feel young. And perhaps that is why the movie can be so nostalgic for adults. It reminds you that before love became complicated by adult responsibilities, relationships could be about something as simple as wanting to be near someone. You wanted to sit beside them. You wanted to hear them talk. You wanted them to notice you. You wanted to know whether they thought about you when you were not around. First love is not sophisticated. It does not need to be. It is often wonderfully irrational. The analytical side of the film is therefore inseparable from its emotional side. The movie uses familiar coming-of-age machinery. The crush. The love triangle. The secrecy. The parental expectations. The misunderstanding. The third act conflict. The reconciliation. None of these devices are revolutionary. But the emotional emphasis is different. Young Hearts is less interested in reinventing the plot than in changing what the plot believes queer adolescence deserves. That is a subtler form of subversion. And perhaps a more sustainable one. Because not every story needs to announce that it is breaking a genre. Sometimes you break a genre by refusing its emotional punishment. You take the familiar structure and simply remove the requirement that queer characters must suffer more than everyone else. That becomes particularly clear in the film's treatment of bullying. The bullies matter, but they do not become the central mythology. They do not get to define Elias's entire identity. The film does not say, "You are queer. Therefore the world will hurt you." It says something much more complicated. The world can be confusing. People can be insensitive. You can be afraid. You can misunderstand yourself. And you can still find a way forward. That is a different kind of realism. Because realism is not synonymous with suffering. Real life contains ordinary happiness too. There are queer teenagers who come out and are embraced. There are queer teenagers who have supportive grandparents. There are queer teenagers whose first love becomes a cherished memory instead of a traumatic event. There are queer teenagers who make mistakes and survive them. There are queer teenagers who are simply teenagers. Cinema has sometimes been so focused on documenting the danger of queer existence that it has neglected the banality of queer existence. Young Hearts restores some of that banality. And banality, in this context, is beautiful. A boy can be queer and still worry about school. He can be queer and still embarrass himself. He can be queer and still have an annoying sibling. He can be queer and still have a father whose music he finds embarrassing. He can be queer and still fall in love with someone who makes him nervous. None of these experiences need to be turned into metaphors for oppression. Sometimes they are simply life. That is why the father's musical presence is such a useful contrast. His world is loud. Elias's feelings are quiet. The father performs identity outwardly. Elias is trying to construct identity inwardly. There is something almost generational about that contrast. Older generations often learn to survive by performing certainty. Younger generations increasingly have permission to question. But questioning can be frightening too. If your parents seem completely confident about who they are, you can mistake uncertainty for failure. You can believe that adulthood means finally knowing exactly what you want. Then you become an adult and discover that nobody really knows as much as they pretended. The grandfather understands this in a different way. He represents the possibility that identity is not a single dramatic revelation. It is a lifetime of becoming. That is perhaps the most important lesson he offers Elias. You do not have to solve your entire life at 14. You only have to tell the truth that you can tell today. That is enough. And sometimes tomorrow will make another truth possible. This is why the movie's emphasis on sustainable happiness matters. A grand coming-out speech can be emotionally satisfying. A dramatic romantic reunion can make an audience cry. But the real victory is quieter. Elias does not need to become fearless. He needs to become willing. Willing to be seen. Willing to disappoint expectations. Willing to admit confusion. Willing to apologize. Willing to love someone without immediately treating that love as a threat. That is growth. Not perfection. And the shouting match is important because it demonstrates the difference. Elias does not become authentic and immediately become emotionally wise. He still hurts people. He still panics. He still reacts defensively. But now those reactions can be examined. Once the truth is outside him, he can finally respond to it. The closet prevents that kind of growth because everything has to remain hidden. Hidden feelings cannot be negotiated. Hidden fears cannot be challenged. Hidden assumptions cannot be corrected. Honesty creates conflict, but it also creates information. And sometimes information is the beginning of freedom. This is why coming out should not be treated as a single heroic moment. It is a process of allowing other people to know the person you already are. For Elias, that process begins long before he says everything perfectly. It begins when he stops pretending that Alexander means nothing to him. It begins when he allows himself to admit that the feeling exists. It begins when he recognizes that shame is not the same thing as truth. And eventually, it becomes possible to let other people see him too. That is the emotional architecture of young hearts. First comes attraction. Then confusion. Then fear. Then avoidance. Then shame. Then conflict. Then honesty. And finally, something much more difficult than a happy ending. Peace. Not complete peace. Not permanent certainty. Just enough peace to stop running. That is why the ending does not need to promise forever. Forever is a fantasy teenagers are often encouraged to believe in because romance stories need destinations. But first love can be meaningful without becoming permanent. Sometimes the person who changes your understanding of yourself is not the person you spend the rest of your life with. That does not diminish the relationship. It can make it more significant. Alexander's importance to Elias is not measured by whether they become an eternal couple. It is measured by what Elias learns when he loves him. He learns that his feelings are real. He learns that desire does not make him broken. He learns that vulnerability can hurt without destroying him. He learns that being honest may change his relationships, but it does not erase his right to have them. And perhaps most importantly, he learns that the future is larger than the fear he had imagined. That is the quiet optimism of the film. The future is larger. For someone trapped inside adolescent anxiety, that is an enormous revelation. Because fear always makes the future smaller. It tells you that one mistake will ruin everything. One confession will destroy your family. One crush will expose you. One argument will end the relationship. One embarrassing moment will define you forever. But time has a way of disproving those predictions. The grandfather represents that time. The family represents continuity. Alexander represents possibility. And Elias eventually becomes the point where all three meet. He is not simply choosing between the past and the future. He is learning how to carry the past into a future that actually belongs to him. That is why the film's happy ending feels different from a conventional romantic payoff. The true romance is not only between Elias and Alexander. It is also between Elias and the possibility of becoming himself. That might sound sentimental, but sentimentality is not automatically a flaw. Especially when cinema has spent so long insisting that queer stories need to be brutal to be meaningful. There is value in a film that simply says, no. We can be meaningful without being miserable. We can discuss shame without ending in destruction. We can acknowledge homophobia without allowing it to become the only defining force in queer life. We can tell a story about coming out without making coming out the end of the world. And we can let a queer teenager experience something audiences of every orientation already understand instinctively. A first love. That is the quiet radicalism of Young Hearts. It takes an experience that has traditionally been coded as heterosexual in mainstream coming-of-age cinema and simply allows a queer boy to inhabit it. He gets the awkward glances. He gets the butterflies. He gets the uncertainty. He gets the jealousy. He gets the argument. He gets the reconciliation. He gets to be young. And he gets to survive being young. That last part matters more than it sounds. Because nostalgia can sometimes convince us that what we wanted at 14 was simply a boyfriend or girlfriend. Maybe it was. But often what we really wanted was permission. Permission to have feelings without interrogating them. Permission to imagine ourselves in romance. Permission to believe that someone could know the truth about us and stay. Permission to picture adulthood without imagining ourselves as permanently alone. Young Hearts offers that permission retroactively. Not perfectly. Not universally. But emotionally. And that is why adults can watch it with a strange combination of tenderness and grief. You may find yourself thinking about the teenager you used to be. Not because the movie exactly recreates your childhood, but because it captures the emotional geometry of it. The rooms where you felt too visible. The rooms where you felt invisible. The people you watched from across a distance. The conversations you rehearsed and never had. The things you pretended not to care about. The futures you imagined because they were the only futures anyone showed you. And then, eventually, the possibility that another future existed. Maybe you did not discover that possibility until much later. Maybe you are still discovering it. That does not make the movie less relevant. It may make it more relevant. Because representation is not only for the teenager currently watching. It is also for the adult who never got to see themselves at that age. There is a particular kind of healing that happens when an old absence is finally filled. You cannot change the past. But you can change the story you tell about it. And sometimes watching someone else receive what you needed can be unexpectedly emotional. You might cry. You might laugh. You might feel jealous. You might feel grateful. All of those reactions are valid. Because nostalgia is not always about wanting to go back. Sometimes nostalgia is realizing what you should have had. Young Hearts understands that distinction. It does not erase the harder stories. It simply adds another story beside them. A story where queer adolescence is allowed to contain tenderness. A story where family can be complicated without becoming monstrous. A story where masculinity can be questioned without being destroyed. A story where first love can be meaningful without being tragic. A story where coming out can be frightening without being fatal. A story where happiness is not treated as naivete. And that last point may be the most important. There is a persistent idea that happy endings are less sophisticated than tragic ones. As if pain automatically creates depth. As if suffering proves seriousness. As if a story has to hurt the audience to earn their respect. But happiness can require just as much craft. Especially when the audience has been trained to expect catastrophe. Young Hearts has to earn its optimism. It does that by taking fear seriously. It does not pretend Elias is never frightened. It does not pretend the social environment is perfect. It does not pretend that relationships survive every mistake. Automatically. Instead, it argues that none of those difficulties require a tragic ending. That is a meaningful distinction. The film's optimism is not based on the belief that nothing bad happens. It is based on the belief that bad things do not have to become the whole story. That is a much stronger form of hope. And perhaps that is why the movie's quietest moments linger. The loud scenes are memorable because they release pressure. But the quiet scenes are memorable because they reveal what Elias is fighting for. A conversation. A look. A shared moment. The simple relief of not having to perform. Those moments are small. But they are exactly what freedom looks like at the beginning. Freedom does not always arrive as a dramatic declaration. Sometimes it arrives as the first time you stop correcting yourself. The first time you say what you actually think. The first time you allow your face to show what your heart is doing. The first time you realize that someone knows and they are still standing there. That is why the title Young Hearts feels so appropriate. The film is interested in the heart before it becomes hardened by experience. Before love becomes strategic. Before relationships become complicated by mortgages, careers, families, expectations, and adult compromises. The young heart simply wants to connect. It wants to be seen. It wants to know whether the person across the room feels the same electricity. There is vulnerability in that. But there is also courage. Elias's journey is therefore not about becoming fearless. It is about understanding that fear does not deserve complete control. You can be afraid and still tell the truth. You can be embarrassed and still stay. You can hurt someone and still apologize. You can be uncertain and still move forward. You can love someone and not know where that love will lead. That is what growing up actually looks like. Not a sudden transformation. A series of small decisions. And Young Hearts understands that. The film's adherence to familiar genre conventions is therefore both its limitation and its strength. If you approach it expecting a radical reinvention of the coming-of-age movie, you may find some of its structures familiar. The archetypes are recognizable. The emotional beats are recognizable. The third act conflict is recognizable. The reconciliation is recognizable. But perhaps the film does not need to reinvent those things. Perhaps the important question is what happens when those familiar structures are finally allowed to contain a queer story without forcing the queer character to pay a higher emotional price. That is the experiment. And it works often enough to be meaningful. Because genre is not only about plot. Genre is also about expectation. Audiences have learned what queer cinema is supposed to feel like. Painful. Important. Heavy. Tragic. Political. Young Hearts says that queer cinema can also feel warm. Embarrassing. Funny. Romantic. Nervous. Ordinary. That does not make it less political. It makes the politics more intimate. A world in which queer children can imagine ordinary happiness is a world that has changed. A world in which queer adults can look back at their adolescence without only remembering fear is a world that has changed. A world in which first love does not have to become evidence of trauma is a world that has changed. That is why the film's gentleness deserves to be taken seriously. Gentleness is not the absence of conflict. It is a choice about what conflict is allowed to dominate. Young Hearts chooses not to let cruelty become the final word. It chooses to let connection have the final word. And maybe that is the kind of ending queer audiences have needed for a very long time. Not perfection. Not fantasy. Just permission to believe that things can turn out okay. If you grew up queer in an era when the stories available to you mostly ended with someone leaving, dying, being rejected, or disappearing, then watching Elias move toward honesty can feel almost surreal. You might find yourself thinking, wait. That's it? He gets to be okay? Yes. He gets to be okay. And you get to be okay too. That does not mean every queer life follows this path. It does not mean everyone gets supportive parents or a loving community. It does not mean fear is imaginary. It means that tragedy is not destiny. That distinction is the heart of the film. And it is why the movie can function as both a coming-of-age romance and a kind of emotional corrective. It does not correct history. It corrects expectation. It gives audiences another possible emotional ending. For younger viewers, that possibility can be immediate. For older viewers, it can be retrospective. Either way, the message lands in the same place. You were never wrong for wanting to be loved. You were never wrong for wanting to be seen. You were never wrong for being confused. You were never wrong for taking time. And you were never required to turn your identity into a tragedy before it became worthy of respect. That is what makes Young Hearts worth defending even when it follows familiar genre conventions. Its originality is not always located in what happens. It is located in what the film refuses to demand from its queer protagonist. It refuses to demand suffering as proof. It refuses to demand perfection as redemption. It refuses to demand that first love become forever. And most importantly, it refuses to demand that Elias hate himself before he can learn to love himself. That may be the quietest revolution in the entire film. Because self-acceptance is often presented as a triumphant finish line. But for Elias, it is more like removing weight. One assumption. One fear. One performance. One lie. One imagined catastrophe at a time. Until eventually, there is less to carry. And when you remove enough weight, something strange happens. You realize you can breathe. That is the emotional journey of Young Hearts. It begins with a boy surrounded by a world that seems to know exactly who he should become. It moves through attraction, confusion, shame, performance, fear, and conflict. And it arrives somewhere much quieter. A boy who is beginning to understand that the world does not get to decide every part of his future. He does not have every answer. He does not need them. He simply knows a little more about himself than he did before. Sometimes that is what growing up actually means. Not becoming certain. Becoming honest. And perhaps that is why this movie can feel so healing. It does not tell your younger self that everything would have been easy. It tells your younger self that you deserved the chance to find out who you were without being punished for it. That is a different promise. A more believable one. A more generous one. And maybe, for a generation of queer viewers who grew up searching for themselves in stories that often treated people like them as cautionary tales, that generosity is exactly what was missing. We did not always need another warning. Sometimes we needed a possibility. Young Hearts gives us one. A small one. A gentle one. A deeply human one. The possibility that a queer kid can fall in love, make mistakes, feel afraid, disappoint people, discover himself, and still reach the other side with his heart intact. That is not a small thing. That is the entire point.
So